Hi, everybody. You probably know me by now. I'm Diane Poole-Heller, and I'm here with the Sounds True Dream Team in Louisville, Colorado, and we're welcoming you to our last day of our Psychotherapy 2.0 Training Summit. It's our 14th day, and we've had a phenomenal time speaking to some of the leading minds, researchers, and practitioners in the world of psychotherapy. I've grown a lot, and I hope that all of the listeners have learned something really valuable that they can help in their own lives and as well as support their clients. I strongly encourage you to take advantage of the upgrade offer on the right so you can get lifetime access to all the recordings, to the 25 presenter bonuses, and to Rick Hansen's 8-hour program on the compassionate brain, activating love, kindness, and compassion. It's great. It's $297, and discount prices go away the next day. So right now you can save $200. Anyway, I hope that you were able to join us last night. We heard from Dr. Ron Siegel on tailoring mindfulness, fitting the practice to the person. He showed us how to help clients and ourselves stay more connected and also step out of our thought stream, not get so caught in comparative judgment, and to increase our affect tolerance, as well as training to cultivate more compassion for ourselves and our clients and people in general. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you tonight to Dr. Dan Siegel. He's going to be talking to us on an interpersonal neurobiology approach to trauma and its treatment, a topic close to my heart. So I'm so glad you're here, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. It's great to be here with you and such an esteemed faculty.
Yes, it's been a great group. And I know you're going to give us a little bit of a synthesis perspective from all of our different presenters as well, which will be really fun to kind of pull things together a bit. I just want to give you a little bit of Dan's background. I know most of you know him already. He's an internationally renowned neuropsychiatrist who's lectured throughout the world. He just got back from Italy doing a conference on trauma and attachment in Rome and Florence, so pretty cool. We're glad he made it back in time to be on with us tonight, so he's hot off the plane. He heads up the innovative group study on interpersonal neurobiology at UCLA in California. He's currently a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA School of Medicine, where he's also on the faculty for the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development. He's the executive director of MindSight Institute, which is a really great educational organization that offers online programs and in-person lectures and to focus on mindsight in individuals, families, and communities. His last 3 books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. They include Brainstorm, and he has 2 with Tina Bryson called No Drama Discipline and The Whole Brain Child. He's the founding editor for Norton's series on interpersonal neurobiology, and he just sent in his 50th book. The whole team there has put together 50 books in this topic, so congratulations. That's quite an accomplishment to all of you. Wow. He's the founding co-editor of UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center, and he wrote Developing Mind, and I have to mention this book. It literally kickstarted my own passion in understanding and teaching attachment theory and combining with trauma resolution work that I've learned along the way. And so I really appreciate that, Dan. You kind of helped me birth a whole new perspective.
Wonderful.
It's been really important for me. And so thank you for that, too.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Right. I know Dan from the Psychotherapy Networker. We bumped into each other there a few times, and also his UCLA conferences, where interpersonal neurobiology meets every winter on various topics. And this winter in 2016, it will be on culture, which I'm sure will be really great. And I have all my students work with Dan's Wheel of Awareness. That if you're not familiar with it, you've got to get on his website, drdansiegel.com. It's on there with lots of other free stuff, and it's a great way to keep up in touch with Dan. And it's had 750,000 downloads, so you got to get it. It's great. It's a great support for your clients and a great support for us as therapists, too. Dan has a conference coming up, Quantum Physics of Psychotherapy, and that'll be in December 2015, and you can find out all about that on his website, too, which is drdansiegel.com, DRDANSIEGEL.com. So welcome, Dan. I'm excited you're here, off the plane from Italy and landing with us first thing.
Ciao, Diane.
Ciao, that's right. Benissimo.
Yes.
So I just whatever you'd like to talk about today will be fantastic, but I'd love to hear a little bit about what really inspires you in your pursuit to really understand and help us heal deep trauma, as well as putting together this whole group on interpersonal neurobiology.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for getting the idea of this, and thank you and Tammy Simon for the timing of just having this come out, which is so important for all people, and especially for therapists who help people, to really combine the cutting edge of science about attachment and trauma and see how we can best help other people. And as you mentioned, this field of interpersonal neurobiology is something that's been really burgeoning in these last 10 years, really since the series started to go into full swing. And so what I'm going to do is try to build on what your other presenters have offered as approaches to therapy and ways of thinking about how you can best approach people who've been traumatized, how to understand insecure attachment, how to work with couples, how to work with individuals. And let me start with basically a framework about this phrase interpersonal neurobiology so we can understand the context of it, because it's not a form of therapy. It's really what you would call a consilient approach, which is E.O. Wilson's term for when you combine all the different disciplines of science together and find universal principles. That's the consilience. And then build a framework, a unitary framework that comes from all the different disciplines. Then you get this new view of, for example, looking at what the mind is and how to understand what a healthy mind might be. So interpersonal neurobiology informs the many different approaches to therapy. So it informs, for example, cognitive approaches, narrative approaches, psychodynamic and psychoanalytic approaches that use the body, like Peter Levine spoke about. It combines work in EMDR with work in something as seemingly distant as quantum physics, and looks at all these different ways of understanding what is the mind, what is consciousness, what is the process of change, and why are there so many different approaches to therapy, some of which have been empirically proven, some of which are being empirically studied, but that many of which may actually work, and how do we understand that, the view of these different approaches. So I'm going to now give you a very brief outline of interpersonal neurobiology. As you mentioned, Diane, there's now 50 books in our series that I'm the founding editor of, and you've had Steve Porges on with you today. He's an author of one of the books in our series. We work with other people who are, for example, with me in Rome, like Ed Tronick and Pat Ogden, Russell Mears, other people, Alan Shore, where we have a lot of different people contributing to this field of interpersonal neurobiology. And what it is basically an attempt to bring an integrated scientific view of what the mind and mental health are to all the different disciplines of mental health. So that would be people in everything from art therapy and dance therapy and music therapy and educational therapy, to people in nursing and social work and psychology and psychiatry, anyone working with a person's mind, even in the various fields of medicine, or clinicians or others, counselors, various forms of therapists who are interested in the mind will find a common home in the field of interpersonal neurobiology. So that's the first thing to say, is that the reason we've been working so hard to bring science to the life of a mental health practitioner and those who are receiving mental health services is because we've had so long this lack of a common curriculum, a common foundation, a common understanding. So that's the first thing to say. And so as we approach the questions you've asked in Psychotherapy 2.0 here on the Sounds True program, we want to ask, what exactly is trauma from an IPNB point of view? That's interpersonal neurobiology's abbreviation. And then what do we do with it in terms of how might it inform what we're doing in our own practice, whatever that practice might be, and how might it expand what we do so that as we more deeply understand what we're doing, we can actually perhaps come up with new innovations. So that's what the field is, and we invite people to join our nonprofit organization, GAINS, the Global Association for Interpersonal Neurobiology Studies. They're at mindgains.org. And this is a group basically which shows how you can apply interpersonal neurobiology in psychotherapy, in parenting, in education, in organizational functioning, in contemplative practices like mindfulness, and in the way you can understand our larger society and how individuals, groups, and collective organizational functioning communities can actually work more collaboratively to bring more well-being into the world. So that's basically what we do. And the MindSight Institute is basically a core home for interpersonal neurobiology. This is where we are, where I work. And you mentioned the Wheel of Awareness, so I don't want to forget it, but the source of the Wheel of Awareness is right there. That's the table from where the wheel came from. And we now have this big new office. So this is my first time doing a program from our new center here in Santa Monica, California. So, Diane, let me just see if you have any questions about that general thing about the foundations of interpersonal neurobiology, just coming from the various branches of science, from anthropology to quantum physics, and anything in between. And then I'll move on and actually point out what some of those fundamental concepts are.
Well, I'm a synthesizer, and I love the whole global perspective. I mean, that it can go in so many beautiful directions in an integrated way. It's really brilliant. So thank you to everybody that's participating in that. I think it's fantastic. And you really are kind of the Carl Sagan of bringing neuroscience, trauma, attachment, and mindfulness and psychotherapy together. So you're the perfect person to be pulling all of this together for us today. So.
Well, that's so sweet of you. Thank you. You know, the exciting thing about joining forces with all of our different branches of mental health, and then all the different pursuits human beings have of understanding reality, and that could be, of course, in the various sciences, but it's also in literature, in the arts and music, and it's extending into contemplative practices. And so I was recently just in Vermont for a week for our academy on contemplative and ethical leadership, and these interpersonal neurobiology approaches were very useful in trying to see the foundation that connected ethical leadership with contemplative practices. And so we'll talk about that too. So let's dive into some of the foundations. The first thing, which is kind of strange to say, and one of my wonderful interns is just sitting over here on a table. We had an internship this summer, and when I revised the Developing Mind, recently we had 15 interns. This summer for these two new books on mind and the wheel, I had 6 interns. And it was kind of startling for us all to find that in a massive review of the world's literature on these subjects, that the framework I'm about to describe to you isn't really shared by any perspective, and yet it is consilient with them. So I'll describe what I mean in a moment, but I guess I feel a little bit lonely saying these things to you because the foundation has a lot of exciting implications, and we're trying to make sure that what we describe is working well with all the different fields that we come across. So it could be, for example, that you are in a field of mathematics, and we would want to make sure that what we're saying is consistent with what's going on in math and physics, in chemistry and biology, including neurosciences and genetics, psychology, with all the various studies even of the processes of psychotherapy, sociology, linguistics, anthropology, all these different fields and much, much more, all these ways of knowing, we want to make sure we can fit in a way that is useful. So the first foundation to say is that in all of these different fields, and this is kind of shocking to say, there's no definition of the mind. So whether it's contemplative practice, which offers descriptions of the mind, the field, excuse me, one moment. So in the field of the theory of mind, the philosophy of mind, there is no definition of the mind. And when we look at fields like my field, psychiatry, or the field of psychology, it's kind of amazing, thank you, that you don't have a definition of the mind that is available. You have lots of descriptions. So the first thing we do in interpersonal neurobiology is address that by offering a definition of the mind, a working definition that we've had since 1992. So that's, almost a quarter of a century. And the definition has had some really interesting implications for predicting future research findings. So from a scientific point of view, it's been very conceptually useful, and then also empirically useful, because you could then predict what independent investigators might discover if they actually pursued certain kinds of things and if technology was available, which back in 1992 it wasn't, but now it is. So you can see some exciting things as you'll see. So let me offer you that definition, because when we think about attachment, developing the mind of the individual, we want to make sure we understand what the mind is, and with only descriptions, it's not really clear how a relationship between a parent and a child will develop a healthy mind. So our working definition of the mind is this, that it is an emergent self-organizing. So emergent means it's arising from something that we'll describe in a moment, and it's self-organizing, which means it is one of the emergent properties of a complex system. So it's an emergent self-organizing, embodied and relational process. And what this means is that it's both in the whole body, not just up in the head and the skull. So it's fully embodied, not just in skull, but it's not limited to the skin nor the skull. It actually is relational. Your connections with other people and even your connections with the planet are both where the mind arises from, that's the emergent property, and in turn regulates. So the full definition is it's a self-organizing, emergent, embodied and relational process that arises from and regulates energy and information where? Within the body you live in, and between yourself and other people and the planet. So within this definition, you, of course, confront one of the most challenging parts about science, which is the majority of scientists these days are saying that the mind is the same as brain activity. And our stance, for the long time, is that that's just not the complete story. That the complete story is much bigger than just brain activity. The brain is important. I wrote a book called The Mindful Brain, and that's fine. The brain is really cool to talk about, but it's only part of a much larger mind story. And in this last book I just sent in last week called Mind, you'll find a deep discussion of this fundamental issue, and certainly in the developing mind. In all the books you'll see a discussion of it. So that's the first thing, a definition of the mind. I thought when I offered that definition in 92, there'd be fun discussions, looking at the various definitions and how you can compare and contrast them. But it turns out, amazingly, there are lots of descriptions, but there are no definitions. So this is a definition we offer. And the second thing we do, and that's the first fundamental thing about interpersonal neurobiology, is the definition of the mind is offered. Second is we talk about what a healthy mind is, because you can look at the mathematics of self-organization and basically say that when energy and information flow is differentiating its flow, that is, finding unique aspects, and then linking that flow to each other, we call that process of differentiating first, like left from right or me from you, Diane, and then linking with respectful, compassionate communication. That linkage of differentiated parts has one name, and it's called integration. And our stance, from a long line of reasoning, is that integration is the basis of well-being, and that trauma is an assault on integration, and that therapy promotes integration in a system like a society or a school or a family or a couple relationship, or within the system of the body, the nervous system and the various aspects of the body, where differentiated parts can be honored for their uniqueness, but then linkages can be cultivated. And that's the prediction. And when a system is integrated, it has the 5 qualities that spell the word FACES. Flexible is F, adaptive A, C is coherent, which means it holds together well over time, E is energized, S is stable, This phases flow is basically the foundations for harmony. And when the system is in harmony, it comes from integration. When it's not in this phases flow, it's actually going to either chaos or rigidity. And in that view, you get this incredible reinterpretation of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, where you find that every symptom of every syndrome in the DSM-3 at the time, then 4, now 5, or 6 or 7 perhaps in the future, we'll see. But for the ones that have existed, all the symptoms of all the syndromes are examples of chaos or rigidity. And our proposal is that the reason for that is because disorder emerges from non-integrated states. So let me give you one example of trauma. In developmental trauma, you see that with neglect, severe neglect, there's an impairment of linkage in the relationship. In abuse, there's an impairment of differentiation, the needs of the child not honored, as there's physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. So you can actually see the process of relational trauma, called developmental trauma, that can lead to what's called disorganized attachment, is actually a direct impairment of the energy and information flow patterns, establishing integration as they do with secure attachment. So that's the relational finding. Then amazingly, the proposal back in the early 90s was that this impaired relational integration will likely lead to impaired neural integration in the brain, but we didn't have the technology to validate that, so it was just a proposal. But now we know from the work of Martin Teicher and others, these studies out of Harvard University showed that what abuse and neglect do, is developmental trauma, is they impair the major regions of the brain of the child or adolescent that are integrative, that is, they link widely separated areas to each other, that can result then in the various aspects of PTSD. So if you want to know those areas, the 3 major areas would be the corpus callosum, that links the left and right differentiated areas to each other, the hippocampus, which is linking widely separated implicit elements of memory to each other, and then the prefrontal cortex, which links the higher cortex with the middle limbic, brainstem, and then lower bodily regions. So it's a vertical integration, as well as actually integrating all of that with the relational world. So there's massive integration of cortex, limbic area, brainstem, body, and social world. Those 5 differentiated sources of energy and information flow are all linked together by this very integrative prefrontal region. And so this is what we mean literally, and here's the amazing statement, Diane, is that when you have impaired relational integration, you get impaired neural integration. And amazingly, you can actually look at the flip side of that. Integrative relationships cultivate the growth of integration in the brain. And what my interns and I found was that every form of regulation, regulating emotion or affect, attention, thought, behavior, memory, attention, all of these forms of regulation are called self-regulation or executive functions. They all depend on integrative regions in the brain. And so to then focus on the topic of your psychotherapy 2.0, for us, attachment, trauma, couples relationships, mindfulness, all relate to the concept of integration. And in couples work, when I see what Michelle Weiner-Davis does, or I see what Ellen Bader does, or Esther Perel do, they're all, for me, all about integration. Or when I look at Peter Levine's beautiful work, or Steve Porges' fantastic work, or Rick Hanson's great work, or look at what Ron Siegel talks about, these are all about integration. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Amazingly, when I first discovered or was exposed to by accident the world of mindfulness, which is very recently, I was struck by that the findings in John Kabat-Zinn and Richie Davidson's studies were basically identical to the studies. You can, I don't know if you remember it, but so I don't need to go on and on. You can,
No, tell us your point.
No, I mean, it was just because I didn't know anything about this mindfulness stuff, but Rich Simon, the wonderful guy he is, he's got social feng shui like
yes.
so high. He put us together on this panel with Diane Ackerman, and I said I don't know anything about this mindfulness stuff, but at that time in 2005, there were hardly any papers on this thing called mindfulness.
It's really exploded since then.
It's exploded, and so I said, look, I read all the papers and I read your books, which were like 2 books or 3 books and less than a handful of papers that he had done. And I said, what's strange is that your outcomes for mindfulness-based stress reduction are identical to my area of research. I'm an attachment researcher in secure attachment, and it correlates to these 2 things, secure attachment, mindfulness, with this region of the brain that's profoundly integrative. So we have neural integration, secure attachment, and mindful awareness that for some reason come together. And in particular, there are these 8 or 9 functions of the prefrontal integrative firing that include, regulating your body, being able to have flexibility in your response, being able to link the past, present, and future in self-knowing awareness, being able to pause before you respond, being able to reduce fear, having empathy for creating basically what I call mind sight maps of other people, as well as these mind sight maps of yourself for insight, being able to actually have moral reasoning, and then accessing intuition. And I'm sure I'm leaving one out.
Insight, I think, but did you say that?
Yeah, insight, well, self-knowing awareness.
Yeah, right.
These functions, amazingly, were damaged in this patient I had who had a terrible car accident, and her whole experience was changed in her family. And when I asked her what it was like, since this region was damaged with the car accident, she said that she had lost her soul. And this was years before I ever heard about this thing called mindfulness, which I sort of heard about by accident, really. But anyway, on the panel with John, you may remember, I'm going, it's just weird. Why are these 3 things going together? Neural integration, secure attachment, and mindfulness. So he urged me to go get, meditation training, which I did at this Mind and Life event. And the bottom line of all that, because that was 10 years ago now, is for me, going and getting mindfulness training, I felt that mindfulness was a form of integration where it paralleled this wheel practice, which I've been doing around this table. I don't like to call it a table of awareness, but it's this wheel where you have this center hub and this outer rim, which I'll talk about in a moment. And because we had talked about ways of integrating the mind in ways I'll summarize in just a moment, but the bottom line is that panel where you were there, it's so beautiful to hear that. I just said it could be that the process of the mind being a self-organizing process and a healthy mind being a mind that integrates, it could be that this is what's in common between secure attachment, where it's relational attunement, and later on I'd learned the idea of mindful awareness being internal attunement, where you're differentiating and observing versus a sensing self, and then linking them, which was something subsequently found by Norman Farb and Zimdel Siegel up in Toronto. And that so this process of integration for me is what mindfulness was about. And years later, we see a bunch of studies that showed that basically the corpus callosum, linking left and right, the hippocampus, linking implicit elements of differentiated memory to each other, and the prefrontal cortex are the major areas that are now developed with mindful awareness training that you learned from Ron Siegel in the prior program. And when you look at this new thing that people call the connectome, which is the interconnected parts of the differentiated brain, we now have a word for it, connectome. When the connectome is highly linked, it means it's highly integrated brain. And a study that just came out, it actually was in Scientific American, a summary of it, which blew my mind, which basically said positive traits in life are associated with a more integrated brain, essentially. This came out just like 3 days ago. So this finding is consistent with the fact that mindfulness, 3 independent studies show that mindfulness increases the interconnectivity in the brain, that interconnectivity is associated with positive traits, and all of this relates to the proposal from 1992, which is that once you define the mind as self-organizing, the mathematics of self-organization says that integration is the source of optimal self-organization.
Makes sense.
That's our frame, and what I'm going to talk about next, see if you have any questions, is the idea that you can then, as a therapist, examine 9 different domains of integration, which is what we do in our 96-hour training program. We actually teach therapists, how to assess chaos and rigidity, and then how to look in a very specific way toward impaired integration, and then cultivate integration across these 9 domains, which is what I'll talk about next.
Perfect.
But any questions you have, Diane?
No, I think it makes sense to me, and I've always thought of, ever since I started trauma work, I thought it was an issue of integration. So it's very validating to hear you stress that so much, because and then to really look and see what is integration, right? So I'm very happy to hear about your exploring this in such great detail.
Well, thank you. You know, I was once going as just a audience member to a conference called Integrative Mental Health, first conference ever, International Conference on Integrative Mental Health. I was so excited. And then when I got there, unfortunately, Richie Davidson was supposed to give the closing keynote address, and he had to go for some emergency or whatever. So they knew I was in the audience, so they asked me to give the closing keynote address. So I said, okay. So I listened very carefully to every presentation. And when I got to my keynote, I said, I'm really confused because this is a conference called Integrative Mental Health. It's been over 3 or 4 days. It's been wonderful. I've learned a lot. But no one has talked about integration at all.
Wow.
What they meant by integrative mental health was, let's do a little acupuncture. Let's take a lot of salmon oil. Let's do, some this kind of therapy, hypnotherapy, this kind of therapy, that kind of therapy. So we integrate all the different approaches to therapy. And so I just said, well, I don't really know how to talk about that, but I will talk about integration just like we're talking about. And that was my talk. But so even though there is this field called integrative mental health, they actually don't talk about integration as a process. They talk about it as a kind of
a little bit more like a menu.
Yeah, a holistic medical approach to mental health,
right.
Which is great, but it's just very different. So let me spend a couple minutes talking about these domains of integration, because it has some very interesting implications for tying together, let's say, family therapy, couples therapy that you heard from our 3 distinguished presenters, work with the body that Pat Ogden does and Peter Levine does, beautiful, beautiful work that Francine Shapiro has gifted to the world with EMDR and her colleagues. We'll link it with, the processes of the brain that Steve Porges beautifully talks about. And I want to make sure I'm not leaving anyone out that you've been talking about here. Rick, of course, it talks about neuroplasticity a lot and positive neuroplasticity. Sue Johnson, I've done a lot of work with, and her basing it on attachment with EFT. Joan Borisenko is talking about the biome and all these wonderful ways where we realize that the mind is directly connected to the body. And in our view, of course, we would share that completely and really look deeply at how the biome is not only changing levels of serotonin and things like that, but directly affecting energy and information flow levels. I talked about Michelle. Bonnie Badenoch, of course, is a wonderful contributor to our interpersonal neurobiology series, and I'm so happy to call her a colleague, and her fantastic books are welcomed by lots of people and really show us. David Wallen, of course, brings in a unique view about attachment and talks about how important it is for the therapist to be aware of her or his own, attachment experience. And of course, there's you and your work. Excuse me, with the siren out there. Your work in attachment and trauma is so important. And then Bill O'Hanlon's various notions. I'm not as familiar with Bill's work on helping people in various ways.
He was talking a lot about integrating disowned parts of ourselves. So he put together kind of inclusive therapy that draws a bit from Ericksonian hypnosis, but also
great.
Looking at how to bring in, what's gotten disowned or rejected in our sense of ourselves. So it's definitely an integrative focus as well.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, there you go. That's great. And Dick Schwartz and I just did a whole 2-day event on internal family systems work that disown parts of the self. So I don't know if that Bill would concur with that, but it's this idea that we have many aspects of ourselves, as we'll talk about in a moment.
They're living in the same neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. So, what's so exciting about it is, again, just to recap, interpersonal neurobiology is not a form of therapy. It is a foundation across many, many disciplines. And it's not the same as social neuroscience, which is a branch of neuroscience, which is a branch of biology. It's very, very different. And so what we want to look deeply at is the idea that these fundamental ideas can inform anyone's approach. So we have people in IPNB from every walk of psychotherapy you can imagine, new therapists, middle career therapists, and senior therapists, who find it actually very welcoming because we've never had a common ground that we can all stand on. So we can say, yes, if you're a narrative therapist, and if you're a psychodynamic therapist, if you're working with the body, if you're a cognitive therapist, if you're working in sand tray work, these are all integrative approaches. And what's been absolutely deeply rewarding for me is by being an educator now in our field, I get invited to do presentations to the international meetings for all these different groups, where we can see that there's so much in common across what seem like completely different approaches. But when you look at energy and information flow patterns as being disrupted, let's say because of attachment traumas, our job is to use the focus of attention, which is a way of streaming energy information flow, to detect chaos and rigidity when it's there. And different approaches don't talk that way, but I think they're all basically doing that. And then once you find chaos or rigidity, your task is to find the domain of integration where there's been an impairment, and then use basically the science of change, which includes all the studies of neuroplasticity that my colleague Norman Deutsch has beautifully written about, and Norman and I used to teach a lot together, where you're basically a neurosculptor using the findings of neuroscience to support the creation of integration in the brain. And in my recent work with Barb Fredrickson in the field of positive psychology, the view I presented to Dr. Fredrickson is the idea that positive states are higher states of integration. So if you look at Rick's wonderful work on the foundations of well-being, to me, even though he doesn't use this terminology, he's really promoting integrative states. When you look at Steve Porges's work, let's say, on the polyvagal theory, and you look at the social engagement system versus the reactive system of fight, flight, freeze, and faint, those reactive states shut down integration. The social engagement system of that receptive state opens it up. So these are just some general comments as we're about to get into specific domains. So what I'll do is just name these 9 domains. You may like to have 3, you may prefer 27. These 9 are not, reified. Our approach to all of us in the field is that we are collaborating to find ways of bringing science to life. And we want to make sure we stay open and always taking in new findings. So like this discovery just a few days ago that was published on the connectome being associated with higher positive states in life, is consistent with where we're trying to build, is continually bring in new data points so we can see, is there validation to what we're saying, is there non-validation, and constantly be open to changing things as we go. So the first domain of integration we're going to talk about is called the integration of consciousness. And back in the 90s, for me, I basically thought about 2 issues that had been arising in this search for consilience. One was that every approach to psychotherapy was using consciousness for some reason. And even though they may have seemed like different ways of doing things, they all required that the client or the patient be conscious of what was happening. Often that involved self-reflection, sometimes not, but always it involved consciousness, even in hypnotic states, like in the Ericksonian work you're talking about. So that was just very interesting. That was very interesting. The second thing was that if it was true that the proposal from the early 90s that integration is health happened to be true, then the question was, what if you took consciousness that was needed for change and integration, which was the basis of health, and you brought them together? That is, what if you integrated consciousness? what would that look like? So back in my old office, I had created this table, which is this table you see right here, which has a center hub. Let me see if I can, center hub there, and an outer rim. And I would bring my patients from their chair or the couch, and I would say, imagine that we're going to place in the hub the experience of knowing in consciousness. Symbolically, it's a metaphor around this table, which the table of awareness didn't sound so cool, so I called it the wheel of awareness. I said, so imagine this is the center hub of knowing, and on the rim is the known. So the basic ways that you begin to integrate consciousness is you differentiate elements from each other. And you may have experienced this in Ron Siegel's work, and this is all of mindfulness basically, where you're differentiating this experience of awareness from that which you're aware of. So the aware of part is the awareness is the knowing, and what you're aware of is the known. And then we could go then around the table, and I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a thing that looks like a spoke right there. That's what actually holds the table up. But I said that's the spoke of attention. And so imagine that you can systematically move from the hub of knowing this spoke around, and the first of 4 segments of the rim would be, and I would literally walk them around the table, the first 5 senses, what you bring in with light with your eyes, sound with your ears, smell with your nose, taste with your tongue, and then touch with your skin. So the first 5 senses. Then we would then move the spoke over to the second segment of the rim, which was the internal sense of the body, which in science we actually call the 6th sense. So that's the interior of the body, muscle and bone sensations, and the sensations of your genitals, your intestines, your lungs, your heart. And then we would explore those very systematically, and then take a deep breath and move the spoke over again. You can do this practice, as you mentioned, on my website. Move the spoke over again, this time to the 3rd segment of the rim, which represents our mental activities like emotions or feelings, like beliefs or attitudes or thoughts, your memories, your dreams, your longings, desires, all that mental life of mental activities. Let's just call it the 7th sense to keep the numbers going. And then you can move the spoke over yet again to the 4th segment of the rim, which, if we're doing numbers, would be an 8th sense, which for me was our sense of connectedness to other people on the planet. And then as I would do this with my patients, the people I work with, I found that it was very useful to actually bend the spoke around so that, and I put that ultimately between the 3rd and 4th segment of the rim, between mental activities and relational sense, that seemed to be the most useful for them, to bend the spoke around so you're actually focusing attention on the knowing of awareness itself. And people with depression, anxiety, fears of all sorts, trauma, found this to be incredibly liberating from those ailments. And it was kind of a very powerful thing to see that if you integrated consciousness, you actually achieved these very deep states of well-being. And then ultimately I started teaching it to my students, the therapists I was teaching, and they started doing it themselves and with their clients, their patients, and they started seeing positive results. So then I felt finally comfortable enough to go out into the world teaching it at workshops, and I do it at a number of different kinds of workshops, including a workshop called Soul and Synapse. And there we just do basically a 3-day workshop in various settings, in churches and the Garrison Institute, different places. And we just do the wheel over and over again. And what I'd like to just share with you is the idea that when people do it, first of all, they get this sense of deep clarity and calm and stability of the mind, which is pretty amazing. It's just a 25-minute practice. But then when they bend that spoke around to aim attention right into the hub itself, for many people, and now I've done this literally face-to-face in workshops with over 10,000 people, and I've gotten the feedback from them. What's been amazing about it is whatever the culture that I'm teaching in, whatever the educational background, whatever the meditation background, 0 or 40 years of meditation, the reports are virtually identical, and I've recorded these and compared them, and it's kind of amazing. But there is an experience that you can go through around the rim that's very similar. But the one I want to talk about just briefly is when they bend the spoke around to aim attention right into the hub of knowing, there is this sense of, and these are just quotes I'll give you, I'm at home, I'm in the deepest place I've ever been, I'm incredibly safe, I'm with God, I'm with love, it is the infinite, it is expansive, it's as deep as the ocean, as wide as the sky. And we were recently doing this at a conference with a bunch of professors from different universities on well-being, and I did the wheel practice, and they were there listening, and it was really amazing to kind of sense what this was about. And when I presented this now to quantum physicists, what's been really, really amazing about it is that if you look at this definition of the mind and say that the mind is a process that's arising from energy flow, and some patterns of energy have symbolic value, so we call them information. And you talk to a quantum physicist about what energy really is, they'll say it's a range of potentials that range literally from infinite potential to a singular potential. Another way of describing it is probabilities. So from near zero probability to 100% probability. So 100% probability is where you know you're going to go for Italian food or something. You're going to have spaghetti. Now you're eating spaghetti. Okay, there it is. But before you go out to dinner, maybe you're in an elevated plateau, some kind of Italian food. You're in Rome after all. You probably have Italian food. But before you even do that, you don't even know you're hungry. You're down toward near zero because there's a trillion things you could do. How do you know which one of the trillion you'll pick? So it's called near zero probability. But what near zero probability is actually a sea of potential. It's what I call in this graph, a plane of possibility. And so when I presented this to quantum physicists, they say this isn't stated by quantum physics, but it's completely consistent with quantum physics. And what the model proposes then is that what the mind is a process that arises as energy is flowing. And what energy flow means is it's the movement of possibility into probability, into actuality, and then back down again. So there's in this perspective then, it's a view that number one, that there's a continuity between a process like thinking and thought, which would be sub-peak values, and a peak being this 100% certainty thing, to mood and intention, which would be these plateaus of elevated probability, down to this open plane of possibility, which in this view, and this is the proposal that I'm offering to you, is the source of consciousness. And this is, I think, why the quantum physicists are so excited about it, and why we're doing this conference on the quantum physics of psychotherapy, because if this is true, and it's just a proposal, but it's consistent with these reports from all over the world, then what we have then is a new idea about the origins of consciousness arising from the energy probability distribution curve being in the near zero plane, and that you could train the mind basically to drop energy from its peaks of thought or emotion or memory down into moods and intention, and down even further to this expansive, peaceful clarity of the open plane of possibility. And in this view, what's been so exciting about it, and at this conference it was kind of funny because we were having lunch with the faculty members, and one of the faculty members said, "Dan, stop talking like that. I don't know what you're talking about, the probability distribution curves, and just why don't you talk about what mindfulness people talk about, which is, the open equanimity or compassion or positivity or something." I said, well, the problem with talking about that, and those are all great terms, but it doesn't get you to the consilience that allows you to go, speak to people in spiritual traditions or religions or whatever folks I talk to these days, and also talk to mathematicians and quantum physicists, as well as we're looking for, the neural correlates of all this, which is interesting but not essential. So you can see that the mind is not the same as the brain, but the mind is arising as energy patterns, and energy patterns means this movement of this probability, which happens both within you and between you. And it's where you can feel and this is this last book I just wrote called Mind, that the mind is happening not just in your skull, but also throughout your whole body, and it's not limited to skull, it's not limited to skin, it's happening in this mind atmosphere or mind sphere that is between us as well. So you can see how relatedness involves something called presence, and in so many ways now you're seeing studies of presence at the heart of all sorts of things. So in this book I wrote called The Mindful Therapist, and in a paper that two of my interns, Suzanne Parker, Ben Nelson, and a colleague, Alyssa Eppel, and myself, wrote called The Science of Presence, we used this plane of possibility and the findings from the wheel to actually try to show why presence is one of the best predictors of your telomerase levels, the levels of an enzyme that repair the ends of your chromosomes. And from the mindful therapist point of view, presence is likely the explanation for John Norcross's meta-analyses of all the different forms of therapy require the presence, attunement, and resonance that creates trust, this part we play in therapy. So all that being said, I said to the faculty member, you've got to stay at the level of mechanisms. And in interpersonal neurobiology, we want to translate that to be accessible, to professionals and to researchers and to parents and to educators and the public and all sorts of things so people can be benefited by it. But we don't want to simplify things. So it's beautiful to have things made accessible and stay true to the actual scientific mechanisms. And what I told the faculty member was, so far, when I'm given enough time, people really get this probability distribution curve. And when I did this recently in Asia, what blew my mind was there were a couple of people who were the heads of monasteries, and I did the wheel practice with everyone at the conference, and they came up to me afterwards, and they were so excited to now teach the wheel at their monasteries. So it's a very exciting moment, because for psychotherapy, what it means is that when you're born, you're born from a sea of potential. And when trauma happens, it restricts your potential down. And it makes it so the chaos and rigidity you experience isn't accessing this open plane. And yet it's a birthright for every human being. And so part of the journey for healing is for the therapist, and whatever approach they find suits them or suits their client, their patient, the key is to actually access that which is empowering to the traumatized individual to gain access to this place of incredible safety, incredible clarity, calmness, that this place is never destroyed. It is never destroyed. And our task as therapists is to really be the Sherpas carrying the burden in some ways, but, the companions on a journey to access this open plane. And it's from there that whatever the stuff that arises on the hub of memories of the trauma, of restrictive ways of being, ways that keep you from deeply, intimately connecting with other people and yourself, that you find ways to access this hub, which is the metaphoric plane of possibility, and not be imprisoned by the rim, which are these plateaus and peaks. So integration from this point of view of consciousness involves a liberation of the source of consciousness. And what the last thing I'll just say about this first domain of integration, and of course there's 8 other ones, is that it ties into each of the others, because whether you're talking about bilateral integration, linking left and right hemispheric processes, or vertical integration, linking stuff in the body to the brainstem, to the limbic area, up to the cortex, or you're talking about memory integration or narrative integration, finding meaning out of the memory of things that have happened, or you're going to what's called state integration, which is where you can have warded off parts of the self, and certainly in dissociative identity disorder, you see this all the time. Or we then have interpersonal integration, where people have been traumatized, have blockages to how they're able to really deeply connect with others, or this process called temporal integration, which is the basic existential issues of our lifetimes, that we want things to last forever, but nothing does. How do you deal with that tension of wanting it, but it's just not part of reality? That you want to be certain, but nothing is certain. And if your life is going well, you want to live forever, but no one lives forever. How do you actually balance those? And then finally, the last one, which I used to call transpirational integration, breathing across all the fields, this is really a form of identity integration where you realize you're not just a separate me. Like, this is a trauma that we all experience in modern society, in schools, and even in science, that we're told that the self lives in the body and the self is separate. But this, as Einstein said, is a delusion. It's a psychotic belief that the self is really more these nodes that we live in, these bodies. The self is really the system that interconnects the nodes, and that we've mistaken the node for the self instead of the system. And when we access this plane of possibility, this hub of the wheel, and this is the practice I do every morning, you know, what you get is this deep sense of, yes, I live in a body and that's a me, but I'm also emerging as a we. And the integration, the differentiation of me and we is important, but their linkage is important too. And we can call that an MWE, a we, you know. So an integrated identity is in many ways an outcome you can experience only when you go through all the other 8 domains of integration. And for someone who's been traumatized, it becomes really important because, you know, you need to have a whole self before you can let a self expand. And this is some of the problems with, I teach with Jack Kornfield, what Jack calls a spiritual bypass. Rigid state that is prone to chaotic intrusions. So we want to really give people this deep integrated way of being a me, a we, and combining them as a we.
And what about an all of us state?
That's the we.
Right. That's another way of saying we. Good.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me about the timing, because I can go through the domains, or I don't know if there's going to be questions. I know we have half an hour left. But
we have half an hour left.
Yeah.
So we could start with some questions, or would you like to do a brief overview of the integrations?
Well, I'll just say this, that what's so exciting about, I think, our field of mental health is that we've had so much separation from each other, so much lack of common vocabulary, a lack of common ground, that I guess I'm really, really excited that by bringing science together with spirituality, and you could probably tell from this view of just the integration of consciousness, that when you look at the deep teachings, at least is what I'm told by teachers in these various fields, whether it's in the Lakota tradition in the Midwest of the United States, or the Inuit tradition in northern Alaska, or the Polynesian tradition in the Pacific Islanders, or you're looking at the larger groups of people who practice in the Islamic faith, the Hindu faith, the Buddhist faith, the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, what you find is incredible common ground through the lens of integration. And this becomes really fascinating. And when you then look at this possible quantum view of the origin of consciousness that I'm suggesting you could experience yourself and see what it feels like for you when you do the wheel. I think it's why there's so much interest in it, because it's a science-based reflective practice that gives you direct personal access to some of the deepest spiritual insights that you get from your own empowerment. I mean, this is kind of the amazing thing. And so the separation between spirituality and science dissolves. And the way we can all work together in mental health to help people, whether it's couples or individuals who've been traumatized, who've had insecure attachment, becomes really huge. There's so much work to do on this planet, not just healing individuals, but healing families and healing communities, and even healing the whole planet. That when people can begin to realize that we're all so deeply interconnected, then I think there's deep, deep hope for how we can turn the course of cultural evolution, the source of human change, around, so we stop treating this planet like a trash can. And so the work of mental health is the work of climate and caring for the planet. They are not separate. The mind is relational, which means between us and other people and between us and the planet. we are healers, which means we are integrators. Literally, making whole is what healing is. And we come to realize our place on earth is a place that's very relevant for our work in mental health.
Ecological psychotherapy.
Yes, from the inside out.
From the inside out, right. From the inside out.
Right.
Well, would you like to take a few questions? This has been great. It's really...
yeah, well, first I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
Yes. So tell me if this makes any sense to you.
Oh, you mean the whole thing?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I've been talking a lot, so.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's some parts of it I'd like to go over a little bit more, when I review it, of course. But I think the orientation to the consilient perspective of bringing all these streams of knowledge together, I think is brilliant, and it's kind of a global orientation, I think, and just looking at what supports integration from so many different vantage points. I always think, the more windows, if you think of a wall and the more windows you have in the wall, right, the bigger picture you're going to see. And I think when we start to move into an integrative focus, it really helps us move with the expansion and start to see where everything starts to have a similarity or connect, but also have its own uniqueness. So it's not really a contradiction. It's always works to really look at it that perspective. And I love what you're really heading in terms of this evolution of bringing things together in all different domains. I think it's a huge perspective, but you're the perfect person to be guiding us in that direction.
Well, I think it's a direction. Thank you. I mean, I think it's a direction that we as a planet and we as a human species, as members of our larger planet, ecosystem, desperately need. And when I think about our work as mental health professionals, I really do feel very deeply that this is a part of our work now. And we may not have thought that way 30 years ago. And certainly with the dominance of a neuroscience perspective that the mind is what the brain does, people get so excited about the brain and so excited about, ways you can work on neuroplasticity, which is so important. But we really need to realize we are mental health professionals. We are psychotherapists, caretakers of the mind, and the mind is not limited to the brain. And we are a deeply, deeply interconnected being. And this is something, sadly, that, science in its formal practice is isolating the mind up to the skull. So this becomes a really, really important issue and I think it's part of what drives me a bit, is to make sure that we in mental health who are translating knowledge for the benefit of human beings and hopefully the whole planet realize that there is a deeper story about what our work is as mental health professionals that sees the mind as fully embodied, not just installed, and fully relational. And in that way, we can find ways to serve and to really help heal many layers of experience.
Beautiful. And I liked what you said too about we're in a mind field. It's not limited to our skin. It's not limited even to the body, but it's also relational in what's happening between us and all of us and the planet and all species. And it's a very deep sense of how connected things really are.
Yeah, I was having lunch with my academic publisher, publisher for science and professional therapy books and stuff. She said, "Well, what do you want to write about? And what are you interested in?" I said, "Well, there's this really weird thing about the mind and how no one defines it, but if you see it as both embodied and relational, all these really amazing things start emerging about what you're supposed to do as a mental health professional that don't come out of a simple statement about the brain or whatever." And she said, "Well, why don't you write a book about that?" So I said, "Well, actually, I don't think anyone would read it except maybe my mom." And she said, "I don't care." I said, "Well, really?" And she said, "Yeah, just write whatever you're passionate about." I said, "Well, I really care about this because there's so many scientists who run around, saying the mind is what the brain does, that it's intimidating for a clinician who maybe isn't up on the science or isn't up on the conciliant view or whatever. So this book I just finished, and it's so fresh in me because I just turned it in a couple of days ago, is I just appeal to the reader to say, okay, we know the stance of mind is what brain does. Just come with me on a journey so you can experience your own mental life as we go through this journey, and we'll get together, me as the writer, you as a reader, so we can actually see what the mind might be. And maybe in the end it is just brain activity, but maybe there is this mind sphere, this mind field. It's hard to say mind field because it's like minds, but this mind web that interconnects.
Goodness for moms, but I'm sure a lot of people are going to be joining your mother and reading this book. What's the title of it? Do you have one?
Yeah, I do. You ready?
Sure.
Mind.
Great. Perfect.
That's it.
I can remember that.
Yeah.
That's good.
And probably the subtitle will be a journey to the heart of being human.
Beautiful. When's it come out?
We'll see. My publisher just got it. She may say, something, this is a piece of nothing and you got to rewrite it. Or she may say it's done. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Okay. Well, there's quite a few
So it should
questions.
be out about a year.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Well, we'll be on our edge of a seat till we get to it. That sounds great. But you have so many books for people to start with. We listed a few of them, but go on Dan's website. He's got a lot of contributions and a lot to digest. So he does have books also that go right into the distinctions of those 9 domains that he started to talk about. So which book would you recommend that they touch into to get more details on the 9 domains of integration?
Yeah, I guess if you're a person who likes stories and that is, examples of actual people and what they went through, and then the science that illuminates the stories, what people went through, I would start with Mind Sight.
Right.
If you're someone who really likes your own personal work and reflective practices and applying these integration ideas to you first, which some people are, which is beautiful. I wrote a book called The Mindful Therapist. And if you're someone who likes to make sure you see the rigorous reference science, then it's the Developing Mind, second edition. And if you're someone who doesn't want to see the science but just wants to see the scientific ideas, then I might start with the Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, which is it's basically a companion for any of the other books. And then if you're an adolescent or you want to figure out what happened with your adolescence, then actually, Brainstorm would be a fun book to read, and that I wrote for adolescents themselves to read. So, and there's all these different, the books all basically talk about the importance of seeing the mind in this larger way, and then saying, how do I create integration in my life or the life of people that I care about.
Okay, great. Well, lots of options there. I would like to give you a couple of the questions coming in from our audience.
Great.
And some of them are kind of going to trauma, nitty-gritty, different perspectives here, but we'll just dive in. Annette wants to know, can you explain how mindfulness can reduce hypervigilance, the hypervigilant neuroception, in survivors of childhood trauma such as sexual molestation or rape at age 5 while being raised in a pathologically narcissistic environment? Now, that is a kind of a supervision question, so I know you can answer maybe in general.
Yeah, in general terms, sure. And I'm thinking about a client, a patient I have had who fit that description exactly, and she actually wrote about the response to this question in an email to me once, and she gave me permission to publish it. So I think it's either in the Mindful Therapist, or it might be, oh God, that's the problem with writing these books. It's either in the Mindful Therapist, it could be in Mindsight, but I don't think so. I think it's in the Mindful Therapist.
I think so too.
Yeah, and it was beautiful. So she described it, and what I can recall about her saying, and you can read it there too, is the following. If you take Steve Porges' idea of neuroception, it means that, first of all, we're born into a body, and the body has an evolutionary history that is encoded in our genes and our epigenetic regulation. And these factors influence the general pattern of the way the nervous system is going to influence the energy and information flow, not just through the head, that is what we usually call the brain, but through the whole body, and how this body is going to interact with the environment, called our relationships. So neuroception is a term that Steve invented, and it's a great term for how the neurological system, that's the neural part, has the perception, that's the perception part, of danger. So it's a natural thing, it's known throughout biology basically, is that we inherit these tendencies that those who had neuroception survived. When you're looking for danger, you survive. And those of our ancestors that didn't, they got eaten, and so they didn't make babies and they didn't survive. So neuroception is a natural product, and it's widely known, in biology and neuroscience that these evolutionary factors make us prone to focus on bad things that could hurt us rather than positive things that particularly are fun or enjoyable or stuff like that. So this, what in science is called a negativity bias, is basically something that we're all there, whether we've been traumatized or not. So now you add the attachment system. So now we're at a mammalian history about 200 million years ago. We became mammals. We developed attachment over, let's say, the fisheye rays who don't particularly have these experiences. As mammals, as young, we're dependent on our caregivers to survive, basically. And then as primates, this has become a very intricate process. And as human beings, we have a very, not unique, but an unusual type of attachment, which is called alloparenting. Allo is other, A-L-L-O, and parenting is, cares for you. So this means that we can have more than one attachment figure. So we need to know that when you talk about this client who had these horrible things happen under the care of one caregiver, we need to ask questions like, were there other caregivers? So we need to realize that we are a species that has alloparenting, and that's very, very important. And sometimes there are other people with whom you can have a secure attachment. Now, the client I'm thinking about didn't have any such thing, so we'll just talk about that, but it's an important question to ask. So now you say, well, how does the attachment system in the body interact with the attachment relationships that are happening in the relational world? And there you can come up with the summary that we said very briefly, was that these forms of developmental trauma impair the development of the integrated fibers of the brain. And Marty Teicher's work showed prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, corpus callosum, that allow this faces flow to emerge, flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. When you build on that and look at some of the findings that Michael Meany has shown up at McGill, that you also have epigenetic changes, that is, you have changes in the non-DNA molecules that regulate expression of genes. And when you've been traumatized, some preliminary studies show it actually affects the part of the brain that's going to be able to regulate emotion. So now let's put that all together. What we've said is that integration of the brain allows for regulation. So because integration is impaired, regulation will be disturbed. We've said that there are epigenetic changes that are going to directly affect the development of the affect regulatory areas of the brain, including areas close to the hippocampus. And then we've said that neuroception exists in everyone, and already this will be heightened, so there'll be a state of vigilance for the danger that was actually experienced, not just that's from 200 million years of history, but this is from, 2 years of history, or in this case, 5 years of history, that things have been happening, let's say, in my life that affected me. So for all those reasons, regulation is challenged. Let's just use that. So now the recursive property of development is such that I've learned from memory to actually be very cautious about trusting people, because I've had a trusting relationship that I was supposed to be able to trust that was a betrayal. And in this betrayal, I've learned to be not relying on my feeling I can rely on those other people. So in all these ways, regulation is off, affect is off, I'm not trusting people, neuroception is hyped up. I'm going to actually have a very stressful life because I've had this experience. Now, as a therapist, within the therapy, and I talk a lot about this in Mindsight and the Mindful Therapist, the key is to play the part, P-A-R-T, of your presence, your attunement, and the resonance you have. Presence means you drop into that hub of the wheel. you reach this plane of possibility. That's the mechanism. The hub is just a metaphor, so that you are able to receive anything from your client. And in that transfer of energy and information flow called communication, you are focusing your attention on the internal world of your client, who possibly, in this case of the person I worked with, never had that with anyone before. And so, as one of my patients once said, the experience gave her a sense of feeling felt. This feeling felt, where you're tuning to the subjective experience of another person from a place of presence as the therapist, allows for resonance to occur. And what resonance is where my state is being shaped by your state, if you were my client. And then there's an experience where, instead of just two people throwing communication lobs at each other, we now become a we. But an integrated we, where I'm not over-identifying with you, and I'm not having unresolved trauma myself, and I go, oh my God, how horrible our fathers, or whatever. I'm being present and really resonating with you. I'm not becoming you. And that way, I'm not going to burn out. I'm compassionately present rather than just over-identifying. So in this differentiated state, I'm also linking, and that's what resonance is. It's a profoundly integrated state. When that integration happens, I believe it creates trust, not just in me, but in you as my client. And that trust is where the neuroception is able to be relaxed. And instead of having the reactive state of fight, flight, freeze, and those are sympathetically driven states, or the parasympathetic state that probably Steve talked about, of the dorsal vagus being activated with the vasovagal response and the dropping of blood pressure and the dropping of heart rate and the feeling of collapse, what we call feigning death, right? Or fainting even. These states of reactivity, instead, when I'm playing the part with the sense of trust, turn on the social engagement system. So in the moment in the interaction in therapy, you are now having the experience, which you may have never had before, of safety. But it's fleeting because you leave the office and who knows what's going to happen out there. So I want to give you homework with the Wheel of Awareness practice when you're ready, where you do some preliminary focusing on the breath, you get yourself stabilized enough, and as you do this wheel, you, as the patient describes in the book, you experience the incredible peacefulness of this plane of possibility. In the wheel practice would be the hub. And you realize that the hub is distinct from the rim. And whenever you have thoughts that people are going to hurt you, or memories of the actual hurting that happened, you have this place, this inner sanctuary that no one can give you but yourself. You, as a therapist, of course, can facilitate its empowering of your client. And this is where the deep change happens, in the relationship with you and in the plastic changes in the brain that access these ways the brain can now create a sense of safety and clarity in this differentiated hub from the rim, which would be accessing this birthright of the plane of possibility. So that's just one way of thinking about it.
Beautiful. Thank you. There's another question here. Have there been studies on the effectiveness of touch as practiced by some SE therapists or craniosacral therapists or other body workers for moving people through early childhood trauma?
You know, that's such a huge, huge, huge question. Let me try to address it very carefully and very systematically. When someone's had early trauma, then the risk of a therapist who's not well trained, certainly, but anyone, of touching, physical touch with the client or patient, obviously has a huge risk of the person feeling that they're being re-traumatized. And so it's a huge question to be extremely cautious about. Now, on the other side, you know, there are studies that suggest that touch is one of the most important ways we communicate with a person. And the lack of safe touch in a child's life can be incredibly damaging. So it'd be natural then to say, if you were trained by Pat Ogden or Peter Levine, to say, yes, you know, touch is what we do here. And so trained in that setting, I'm sure that people are finding that it's extremely healing. And I know for myself, there are times when a patient will ask at a certain moment, and we'll talk about it ahead of time, that I hold their hand when they're going through a trauma, and that has been a huge, huge part of them not feeling alone. In terms of research studies of this being done in a systematic way, there may be such studies. I'm not aware of them, but even the lack of such studies doesn't mean that if you're properly trained and doing careful things, it might not be an effective way of approaching things. I myself, am not trained that way, so I don't. I may hold a patient's hand in a controlled, planned out way, but I would be extremely cautious. The other thing I'll just say is this: is the person of the therapist and their intention and what they go through is so vitally important just to acknowledge. And if the touching is meeting a need of the therapist, even if it's done without sexual involvement, I think it can be very damaging to a client. And so, unfortunately, it's really our bodily presence and issues we may not be aware of. We need to, if we're making a choice to touch, we need to make sure that's not working out our own issues. And so these are very complex questions when it comes to touching, and being extremely clinically cautious, of course, forensically cautious, is important in considering all these things.
And you're really highlighting the need to be specifically trained, of course, as well.
Yeah,
yes,
I mean, as you probably know, Diane, and I've seen it too much, patients that I've seen that have been to other therapists who become sexually involved with them started, in each of the cases that I've worked with over these many years of being a therapist, they each started with, the idea of helpful touch. These are all people not trained in somatic therapies, but, helpful touch, you need touch, you never had as a baby, you never had this, and then it turned into, a sexualization, and it was an absolute disaster.
And that's when therapy stops.
Yeah, well, therapy stops, and deep traumatization of someone who, went for help to try to, especially if they've had developmental trauma, they were already betrayed by people they were supposed to trust, and now one of our members of our profession, mental health professionals, used that vulnerability for their own, whatever.
In the worst case scenario, right?
Worst case scenario. Yeah. So, I've had quite a few of those people have come to me after being through that experience. So I am, so respectful of the need for important, and the word boundary is overused, but the important respect for the needs of the client and their integrity to be honored.
Right. And then, of course, there are professional craniosacral people and, SE touch work and body workers that have boundaries and have an awareness of working with trauma. I think
right.
Body workers having an appreciation of trauma, like craniosacral people understanding what's happening in the nervous system. Some people have integrated their trainings in a way that probably, can be very beneficial to people too, under the right circumstances.
I would think so, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's a beautiful, beautiful approach, and the proper training is essential.
Absolutely. Karina asks you, it seems that you can work on different domains of integration while working on a variety of traumas and in therapy in general. Is this true, or do we need to go through these levels of integration sequentially?
Well, that's a great question, Karina. And Diane, I know we mentioned that my jet lag may need to stop, but I can go forward a few more minutes if you want to.
Yeah, that's fine. We could do maybe one more question after this if you have a brief answer to this one.
Yeah, so let me just suggest that if you look at each of the domains of integration, and I'll just I'll give a kind of an amplified response if I might, if that's okay with you, Diane?
Sure.
Yeah, so integration of consciousness, just to begin with there, with trauma, and first of all, the answer to the question is yes, you can work on many simultaneously. However, the integration of consciousness may be someplace just to keep track of, to give the relief that the rim is not the whole story. that there's a much deeper source of inner strength, of resourcefulness for the client that's available to them, and realizing you can offer that to them is extremely important. In bilateral integration, we need to remember that while it's in neuroscience, it's really important to honor that studies are showing many things are linked together across the hemispheres. There's a lot of evidence to support that the left and right are actually quite different from each other. Autobiographical memory and bodily representation are primarily on the right, and more logical, bodily distant experiences using linguistic aspects of language and linear thinking are more on the left. So if we talk too much in therapy, we can align ourselves more with the left mode of a client, when in fact the deep bodily memories and the autobiographical images are right dominant. So we need to really attune to the internal world, realizing that the left hemisphere of the client and the right hemisphere of the client have a very different subjective texture. And so for us to feel the left and to feel the right may be very different inside of us. And realizing that the corpus callosum may have had challenges in its development, these two hemispheres can almost act as if they're separate brains. And so when someone who's been traumatized, this becomes just very important for you to feel what it's like inside of you. Honor those differences. Both are important, but realize that ultimately you're going to honor differences and promote linkages. For vertical integration, sadly, especially with developmental trauma, there's often a very deep sense that the body was a source of vulnerability. And so the cortical consciousness and the bodily sensations can sometimes be quite divided. And as one of my clients I talk about in the Mindsight book said, she just cut herself off from the neck down. So vertical integration can be quite challenging in someone who's been traumatized, and just being very careful about that and realizing that a sense of panic can emerge if we go too fast, even on the wheel of awareness part of the body. So really just going slow and knowing that the body is more than a transport vehicle for the head is just an important thing to remember. Now, in memory integration terms, what you can find, and for some reason not many people know about this, but when I first wrote about it in the early 90s, to me it was like so helpful as a therapist working with severely traumatized people to know that implicit memory cannot be blocked either by dividing attention, which happens with dissociation, or by cortisol secretion that shuts down the hippocampus temporarily. You still get implicit memory embedded into the nervous system, which would include emotional memory, procedural memory or behavioral memory, the memory of perceptions of images, as well as the memory probably of bodily sensations. These elements of implicit memory, if the hippocampus has been blocked by cortisol or divided attention, when they're not linked together into what's called explicit forms, when they arise in consciousness, when they're retrieved by a cue, they can feel like they're happening all over again. They aren't tagged with something. In the now. So when I read about this in the late 80s and started applying it in work with clients in the early 90s, it was so helpful because it was an explanation for flashback phenomenon. So part of the therapy then of integrating memory is to honor these differentiated aspects of implicit memory, but then with the focus of attention on them using what's called a dual focus of attention, focusing on the implicit memories, but also focusing on the here and now with you as the therapist. You can then take these unintegrated forms, bring them into explicit, either factual memory or autobiographical memory, and both, hopefully. And that is then the way the memory, when it's now retrieved, you've modified its form. And so it's a way of reformulating the embedding of memory, because memory, as my memory mentor, Bob Bjork, would say, memory retrieval is a memory modifier. And this is literally in the brain. We're now learning new ways of reconsolidation that we've known about in certain fundamental ways since the early 90s. And so you'll see in the Mindsight book discussion of how you can do this. Narrative integration is where you take those now integrated explicit memories and you make meaning out of the madness that happened. And, in the attachment research that I've done and my colleagues have done on the adult attachment interview, it's the only instrument we know of that uses narrative to highlight something very important, that you can actually ascertain unresolved trauma, not just the experience of trauma, and show that when people resolve trauma, their kids actually do really well. So this was what drove me to write The Developing Mind in the first place, was to ask the question, what does resolving trauma really do to the brain? And what does it do in our relationships? And so in The Developing Mind, you'll see basically that question addressed. But narrative integration is how we make sense of things, and it's a profound way of integrating the brain and our connections with other people. Finally, there's the other one, state integration, is where, especially if there's been dissociation, we have many warded off states, states of vulnerability, states of fury, states of sexuality. And you can look at not just people with dissociative identity disorder, of course, but with lots of forms of trauma, you see dissociation there. And so state integration is where you'd look deeply at that. And as Karina's saying, you can work at all these levels all the time. So it doesn't, I mean, in a book, of course, you have to write them in some kind of order, although in the pocket guide, it's all kind of happening at once. But, you know, you can.
It's multifaceted.
It's multifaceted.
Multidimensional.
So that's state integration. Interpersonal integration, of course, is everything we've been talking about betrayal and about how it is so crucial we honor the integrity of our clients and give them the experience of joining with respect and allowing that to be so important, because it's the very thing that obviously with attachment trauma was violated. And then with temporal integration and identity integration, these are very important too, that, you know, understanding that you can live with uncertainty, which is hard for someone who's been traumatized. With the wheel practice, with the integration of consciousness practice, that plane of possibility, the hub of the wheel, is filled with uncertainty. So for a person who's been traumatized, that can actually be really scary. So you want to, but you're driven to stay on the rim. You're driven, even if it's about traumatized memories, somehow you're driven to stay in these plateaus and peaks. So part of the job of temporal integration is to allow someone to be able to drop into that plane of possibility and to feel that uncertainty is not their enemy. And this is part of that whole domain of integration. And then finally, in identity integration, it's the idea of, well, if I'm emerging as a little baby, as a toddler, as a preschool kid, as an elementary school kid, and I'm being abused at home, this developmental trauma, I'm being neglected, I'm being overtly abused, those forms of developmental trauma, who am I? Because, you know, as Helen Keller said, you know, she was born when she got connected, her mind was born when she got connected to her teacher, Anne Sullivan. So these attachment experiences aren't just memories, they're ways that our sense of self are shaped. And so in many ways, identity integration is all about these forms of trauma and how you can find an inner core that isn't completely isolated from other people in the world, but actually can be differentiated and linked. That's part of the whole journey too. So this is just to get a little deeper into specifically how does trauma overlay with these domains of integration. And Karina, you're absolutely right. We work on all these different layers. And what's been amazing to me is to see how they kind of interact with each other and support each other. And when you work from an interpersonal neurobiology framework, it's just fascinating. It doesn't mean you have to give up whatever method you were taught in, but what's beautiful about it is it's so grounded in this global frame, and it's based on health. You know, our whole view is that integration is health, and challenges in integration lead to chaos and rigidity. And so the model moves you toward well-being, not just a removal of symptoms, but actually the creation of integration, which is this deep sense of an integrated identity, and also basically integration made visible is kindness and compassion. And so you see this emerging within the person toward themselves, kindness, compassion, and in their connections with other people.
Beautiful. And I've seen that happen with my clients. It's a great articulation of that whole process. So thank you for going deeply into that. And I know it's even more articulated in the books that you mentioned. And it really, in going into that, you answered quite a few of the other questions, touched on the other questions. So I know there's more. We could talk to you forever. And I also know you just got back from Italy. And so we'll end the questions part here.